Hello, I'm the Traveling DM, and today I want to talk about traps. How can we make them more exciting and more consequential to our players? So, in the rules as written, usually what happens is if you trigger a trap, you usually roll, and if you fail, you take some damage. It's not very exciting, it's usually not a lot of damage, it's more of a nuisance. Players don't really fear the traps, and so they'll just kind of blindly walk, at least in 5e. The alternative is that you could have some of the old school traps, which were so deadly that sometimes they were one shot and you died. That also doesn't feel that fair either. We don't really want death by trap to really be that frequent. So we want kind of a happy medium here, and we also want it to be meaningful. In other words, we want traps to be scary. So one of the things you have to keep in mind is that when you look at the character sheet, everything is up for attack, not just health points. And so I'm going to go through some trap ideas here. So I've created some trap cards that work with our traveling through the dungeon cards from a previous video. And you can also insert them into your treasure card deck, right? So they work in both. I insert them in both. That's where I think they belong. And the way that they work here is I'll go through each one. And I think you should also think about damage type, which is something that I'll do a separate video on to make different damages more interesting. Now again, this is basically simulating in a more interesting way rolling on a table. So our first one here is an acid trap, and the way it works here is you get a spray of acid. Now in my games, acid does AC damage, so it damages your armor by melting it. And so here you take 1d6 AC damage. If a 1 is rolled, the armor or shield, player's choice, is destroyed. Pretty scary. You do not want to get the acid trap. The other thing is you roll for body damage. So many of these traps use this dice, and I'll put a link to it. And it basically has a body, and it has little stars, which is hard to see on this camera, that tell you where they hit. So there's head, arms, legs, and body. And so it says here, if you roll the body damage dice, and if it says that you got hit in the face, you take 1d4 to your charisma. So now we're attacking both stats and AC rather than health points. This is much scarier for our players and much more interesting in our game than just taking a few HP hits that nobody cares about, because they know that they're going to be able to heal through it. It's usually not that much, or it's some ridiculous number, which feels unfair. So now we have a scary trap. You do not want to set off an acid trap because you can lose quite a bit here. It's really hard to get a charisma point back on there. So this is kind of simulating the idea of, hey, you got a scar on your face, right? If you tell your players you have a scar on your face, most players, if they're like mine, it doesn't really matter to them unless they are really, really into roleplay. That scar basically becomes forgotten. It doesn't really come into play. So this is, you're losing charisma because you basically scarred your face. Our next one here is a spike trap. And this one is going to be an intellect check and DC 15. And if you fail, you take 1d6 damage, or half if the damage, if this check is successful. That's because you just got to spike through your foot. And then you're going to roll the body dice, and if you got hit in the leg, you're going to take 1d4 dexterity damage. Why? Because you just got a spike through your leg. Injured leg. Here is an old favorite, the boulder trap. So, a boulder's falling from the ceiling, and it hits you. Now you're going to roll the body dice to determine where it hits you, and that's how much damage you take. If a heavy boulder hits you in the arm, you're going to lose strength, leg, dexterity. And if you get hit in the head, you're going to lose some intelligence. Pretty scary trap, much more interesting than just having boulder fall on you and you take 1d6 damage. Here we have a blade trap, right? Swinging blades. It's a DC 15 dexterity check. Now you notice sometimes I have a check and sometimes it's automatic damage. That's also to make it more interesting, right? A boulder falling, you might not be able to dodge. Something like this is more of a skill. It's a dexterity check. You're going to take 2d6 damage, or half that with a successful check. So it's a much deadlier trap, and that's because there's multiple swinging axes here. And again, you're going to roll your damage dice, and you're risking losing dexterity. Next one here we have is a flame trap. And we're going to use a wisdom check. Why? Because you're going to need some wisdom to determine, hey, there could be some flame jet coming out of that area that seems a little bit darkened. And again, this one takes 1d10 damage. I really try to switch up the amount of damage some of these do to make it more interesting. And then you're going to once again roll the damage dice. And if you get a hit in the face, you're going to take wisdom damage this time. And then we have a simple arrow trap. You trigger an arrow trap, and it hits you in the arm for 1d10 damage. You're going to roll the damage dice, and if you get hit in the arm this time, you take a loss of strength. If it's on the right arm. If it's the left arm, you damage your dexterity. Again, just to make it more interesting for the player and for us. So what we've done here is we made the traps using this body dice and really thinking about different damage types rather than just looking at HP, kind of attacking everything on the character sheet. We've now made traps much scarier, but not necessarily deadlier. In other words, the damage is really kind of negligible for most of these, but what's really going to sting is the injury that's being suffered and the effect that it has on the stat, which is really what we're trying to replicate here, right? There is a table that tells you, oh, you got a scar, or you've injured your arm, or you've injured your leg, but it doesn't really give us any mechanics for what that means. And if it does, it's usually something you have to remember, like, oh, I have disadvantage, or, I have -2. That's really hard to keep track of. There's nothing to keep track of here. You lose that dexterity, lose the dexterity points, or the strength, or whatever the stat is. You minus that, and that's permanent, and that's your new score. So you really want to avoid those traps. Now, can you disarm traps? Yes. If you look at our previous video, again, with dungeon exploration, you will see that certain classes have the ability to disarm traps when they are triggered. Now, for those of you who are wondering, this is the rules that I use for exploration, and you can see that you roll your proficiency dice, and if you have a rogue on a 4+, you're able to disarm that trap. So if you pull a trap card while you're traveling through the dungeon or while looking for treasure, the rogue has the ability to disarm that. So that makes the rogue a much better person to both search for treasure and to lead the party if what you're worried about is traps. Whereas the other ones you can see do different things that are also very useful. So it really depends on what the party's need is and what risk they're willing to take. And remember, the traps go back in the pile once they're drawn. So they never go away. The only thing that goes away is the treasure or the dead ends and the safe areas. So the dungeon continuously gets more dangerous the longer you're in there. More traps get activated, more monsters become aware of your presence and start wandering the different dungeon corridors.